7. Cognitive psychology, mind versus computer. In the previous segment, I discussed psychotherapy, starting with Gestalt approach that put the responsibility on the rational individual, and humanist psychotherapy focused on fulfillment, while existential psychotherapy emphasized meaning. In this segment, first I'll discuss cognitive psychology that emerged after the Second World War, in which the focus shifted from behavior to perception and memory, and how the mind works, especially in the light of the invention of computers. Cognitive psychology saw the limitations of behaviorism as well as psychoanalysis. Behaviorism focused on learning, but it failed to adequately explain perception and memory, but most crucially, it failed to explain intelligence. While psychoanalysis focused on the subconscious or unconscious, it too failed to fully explain why some people like Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung were able to have such insight while others did not. How is it possible for minds such as Alan Turing to invent the computer that broke the German Enigma code? While behaviorism and psychoanalysis saw a uniformity in standard among individuals and that they all behave in the same way under certain conditions, we all have the same unconscious mind, but they fail to understand the differences in our cognitive abilities. One of the biggest problems with both behaviorism and psychoanalysis was that they made the individual somewhat powerless in the face of their environmental conditioning or the unconscious beast. So cognitive psychology emerged to tell us that the human mind is one of the most sophisticated and powerful machines out there. Instead of hindering us, our mind is immensely empowering. To fully understand cognitive psychology, let's discuss its sociocultural context. One of the characteristics of the modern condition is the prevalence of machines dominating society and determining our lives. This is beautifully depicted in the novels of Franz Kafka, such as The Trial and The Metamorphosis, in which the individual feels paralyzed under the weight of modern bureaucracy. While novelists such as Kafka and Aldous Huxley warned about machines sucking out our humanity, psychologists, instead of pushing back against technology, try to use science to align humans with machines. So a new school of psychology was born. Cognitive psychology tries to look at the human brain in the light of advancement in the machine, and especially computers, to understand how to empower individuals rather than complain. Cognitive psychology has its origin in Gestalt psychology. As I discussed before, Gestalt psychology focused on perception and how the mind organizes perception, but most crucially, rationality is the best tool we have. As a result, cognitive psychology expanded on our perception, how it becomes memory, and how memory in turn influences perception. Therefore, we are able to utilize it to improve our lives. In short, cognitive psychology wanted to understand the connection among attention, memory, and intelligence. Before I go any further, let me define a few important terms used in cognitive psychology. The main focus of cognitive psychology is the perception and memory. When we deal with the outside world or even our own internal experiences like feelings and imaginations, we have tools to perceive information like our sensory system. Philosophers, especially those who came after Kant, argued that we cannot fully know reality, but we only have partial perception of reality. So what is perception? Simply put, perception is sensory signals we receive through our bodily senses such as sight, hearing, smell, touch, and taste. Perception also includes how the mind interprets those signals. Our senses perceive information from the outside as well as from inside, but we are not fully aware of most of the sensory data we receive. What we are aware of is called attention, which is a more focused perception. So perception includes all sensory signals, while attention is what we are aware of. Also interesting to note that cognitive psychology is primarily interested in attention and memory, so that individuals can utilize them for more creativity and productivity. How about memory? As we receive sensory data, we are only attentive to some of it, and most of it ends up in our memory. But there are two kinds of memories, short-term memory and long-term memory. Short-term memory, which is also known as working memory, is accessible to us immediately. while long-term memory tends to be buried in our deeper consciousness, like the unconscious, but also influences our behavior in ways we are not aware of. So short-term memory is somewhat similar to random access memory or RAM in a computer that deals with the ongoing tasks. Long-term memory, on the other hand, is somewhat similar to hard disk storage in that everything that is not needed right now goes in there for future access. While we can choose what to put in our computer hard drive, we have no conscious choice when it comes to our own long-term memory. We cannot delete it. Therefore, good or bad memories stay with us. As I discussed earlier, Freud and Jung argued that those memories stay in our unconscious that from time to time come back to haunt us when triggered. Or on a positive side, they become involuntary memories that transport us into our past as it was depicted in Marcel Proust's novel In Search of Lost Time. Now that we established working definitions for perception, memory, and attention, let's talk about some of the leading cognitive psychologists. First, I'll look at psychological studies of perception, then move on to discuss memory, and finally, I'll deal with cognitive therapy as a solution to our cognitive issues in the modern world, which is how to take control of the mind to enhance our lives. Perception. Wolfgang Kohler, who lived between 1887 and 1967, was a German psychologist in the Gestalt branch. He questioned behaviorism as being too simplistic an approach that limited learning to environmental conditioning. Kohler instead argued that learning is a complex and dynamic process, and behavior psychology failed to credit intelligence and insight. When animals interact with the environment, they're not passive learners who only take what the condition allows them. Instead, they are also inventors, problem solvers, and insightful learners. By focusing too much on the outside environmental conditions, behavior psychology failed to understand how an animal's mental structure organizes perception. It's neither passive nor one-way street, and that everything originates on the outside and animal only reacts, but rather the animal has a robust mind of its own that influences reality to some degree. This is similar to Kant's philosophical argument that we impose our mental structure on the world. While Kohler's argument that humans are insightful learners and proactive in shaping reality, his arguments remain somewhat philosophically abstract. But our next cognitive psychologists made concrete cases for proactive perception and how the human mind is a powerful machine that impacts reality. Leon Festinger, who was born in 1919 and died in 1989, was a Russian-American psychologist who, also drawn to Gestalt psychology, further cemented the argument that we are not passive absorbers of information, but rather we have our own filter. In other words, our mind is very selective in what information to take in and what to ignore. You might ask what this filter is called. Festinger gave the example of our beliefs and convictions in how we see the world. In other words, we have biases, beliefs, convictions that allow us to see the world in a very particular way. We are not objective when it comes to reality. While our biased lens is commonly accepted by many, but how do you scientifically study human convictions shaping reality? Festinger looked at how individuals deal with the contradictions between belief and reality. Festinger coined the term cognitive dissonance, which means that when the evidence contradicts our strong belief, we feel discomfort due to our internal inconsistency. He studied a cult whose leader had received a message from aliens that the world would end on a certain date. However, when it didn't happen, instead of the cult members acknowledging their mistake, they became even more stronger in their conviction and found loopholes to justify their beliefs. This study, Oak Park as it's known, showed that the human animals are not passive to reality or evidence, but rather proactive to change reality or the environment based on their beliefs. In other words, we're not just conditioned by our environmental evidence, but we also condition our environment through our cognitive beliefs. First, we are shaped by reality, but we also shape reality in return. We are agents shaped by change, but we are also agents that bring about change. While Festinger showed that our belief and conviction narrow our perception of reality, it also helps us to create reality in some way. But the question remained as to how our mind decides what external evidence to accept and what evidence to reject. This question was answered by our next cognitive psychologist. Roger Shepard, who was born in 1929 and died in 2022, developed a theory that our mind not only interprets data coming through our sensory organs, but the mind also actively makes conclusions based on its own internal 3D model of the outside world. In other words, there is the outside world, we receive sensory signals, but the mind doesn't just sit still. Instead, it tries to make sense of the data, but actually rationalize its theories and come up with snappy conclusions. This happens so quickly for us to fully register. Why? The simple answer is pattern recognition. When we eat something delicious like a cherry, our mind quickly registers as a good food we can eat again. So next time we come across cherry, it's easy. This became known as the law of generalization. We are wired to generalize all cherries as delicious. So animals are programmed to recognize patterns and generalize. In his experiment, he showed his subjects optical illusions, and the subjects were able to see through the illusion or rotate objects in their mind. Since you cannot fool people with some illusions, he concluded that the mind has an internal map of the external objects. What we perceive in our mind doesn't exist in our mind, but on the outside. But our mind thinks that the internal model is as real as the one on the outside. He famously said that the perception is externally guided hallucination. What we perceive to be real only exists on the outside, yet our mind thinks it does exist on the inside too. Therefore, he called externally guided hallucination. Dreams or actual hallucinations, on the other hand, are internally stimulated perception, he argued. In other words, when we dream or hallucinate, the thing doesn't exist on the outside, but entirely on the inside. Perception, however, does exist on the outside, but not on the inside. So Shepard concluded that our mind is able to rotate objects in the real world, not physically, but imaginatively, because the mind has a 3D model of the outside world. On a more philosophical level, many philosophers believe that the mind contains everything in the universe, or the universe is actually a mental reality. For example, Schopenhauer says, all ostensible minds can be attributed to matter, but all matter can likewise be attributed to mind. To sum up, while behaviorists ignore the capability of the human mind to shape reality, cognitive psychologists such as Kohler, Festinger, and Shepard were able to see our perception as a very active agent in shaping reality. Now let's shift our attention to attention. What is attention and how does it work? Is it a funnel or more like an ocean? Attention. Donald Broadbent, who was born in 1926 and died in 1993, was a British psychologist and active around the same time as Alan Turing, whose computer was instrumental in hacking into the German Enigma machine. While working as a fighter pilot, Broadbent observed that a lot of man-made accidents happen because pilots mistook a lever for one thing for something else when they were bombarded with too much information. Since information overload can overwhelm us, he came to the conclusion that our attention has a limit. So he concluded that the human mind processes information in somewhat similar fashion to a computer. His study, which is known as dichotic listening experiment, was carried out among air traffic controllers, where he noticed that they did the most effective job when they were dealing with one message at a time. This selective attention to a particular voice was somewhat akin to a filtering system in which the subject had to silence other voices to solely focus on one voice at a time. He used a Y-shaped tube as an analogy, When two separate messages enter the bottleneck, the flap only open for one message at a time, which is known as the broadband filter model. For example, when two voices came through at the same time, the brain has to make a snap decision which one should come first. It's all done in the short-term memory stage. Quote, one of the two voices is selected for a response without reference to its correctness and the other is ignored. But how does the mind make that decision as to what message to store first? He argues that filtering depends as much on the content or message of the information as it depends on other factors such as clarity of voice, prior expectations, prior experiences, and memories. In other words, the short-term memory is sometimes open to new information, but most of the time it simply selectively listens to things based on other factors. Broadbent used cocktail party as an analogy in which people hear many voices but only listen to one, not the others. So to sum up, Broadbent argued that there is a clear limit to our attention and realistically we can only listen to one message at a time. And we choose which message based on the content of the message, but also prior memories or expectations. So just like other cognitive psychologists, he argued that the human mind is an active agent in shaping reality, not a passive agent that only absorbs reality. Our attention is pretty instrumental and proactive in how it selects what to listen and what not to listen. Now that we have established that perception is not one-way street or slave to the outside world, the fact that the mind itself has an intention of its own is very selective, we move on to the second topic of cognitive psychology, which is memory. How does perception turn into memory? Memory. The pioneer of memory studies was Hermann Ebbinghaus, whom I discussed in a previous segment. He tested his own memory by trying to memorize meaningful words and then a bunch of nonsensical syllables. He concluded that our memory favors things that are meaningful to us, as well as how long we expose ourselves to them and how long after we want to retrieve them. So, we remember things that have certain use to us, the longer we spend time dealing with those things, and finally how soon we need those things. So, unlike a computer, human memory is purpose-driven and time-sensitive. To understand human memory, let's discuss how the human brain makes decisions. As Shakespeare's Hamlet holding a human skull and asking what to remember and what not to remember. Then, once it has decided what to remember, how does it do it? Zegarnik, who was born in 1901 and died in 1988, was a Russian psychologist who studied how the brain is biased towards unfinished tasks. When researching, she found that when a task was incomplete due to an interruption, the participants were more likely to remember the task. For example, waiters were more likely to remember customers who hadn't paid than those who had paid. In other words, the memory is biased towards a task that is yet to be completed. The brain forgets the task that is done. This phenomena is now known as Zegarnik Effect, which means our memory retains more when we have regular breaks. So the brain prioritizes things to be done. This is also called the working memory because the task is not complete and needs our attention. Now that we understand that our memory favors an incomplete task rather than completed tasks, how does it do it? George Miller, who was born in 1920 and died in 2012, was an American psychologist who took up William James' distinction between short-term and long-term memory by focusing on how short-term memory really worked. Incidentally, he also worked at MIT with Noam Chomsky, whose theory of universal grammar sits at the heart of linguistics, and also co-founded the Harvard Center for Cognitive Studies. Miller used the data processing of a computer as a model to study how the human mind handles short-term memory. In his famous paper with a mouthful title, The Magical Number 7, Plus or Minus 2, Some Limits on Our Capacity for Processing Information, in 1956, he argued that memory is not one giant storage space, but rather divided and organized like an efficient system, somewhat similar to a channel that information flows through. When we perceive information, it goes through our short-term or working memory. But since our short-term memory has a limited storage capacity and has to deal with information overload, how does it do it? It organizes information into categories or meaningful chunks, just like any large processing system. Once those meaningful chunks are created, they are easier to store in long-term memory. A good analogy would be how a library stores its endless books. It divides them into categories and subcategories. Miller realized that there was a certain limit to our working memory. It's like our digestive system. The food goes through our mouth, where larger ones are crushed into sizable chunks because our esophagus has limited capacity. Of course, when it comes to information, it's not a physical phenomena but a mental one, so you don't need teeth to crush information. So the limit is not physical but rather a mental processing limit. He settled on number 7. In many studies prior, he observed that the human mind could generally keep up or hold attention for up to 7 elements or chunks of information. Once we are bombarded by more than 7, the memory prioritizes some and ignores the other. A water dam is perhaps a good analogy as it channels water into streams, but since water is a physical matter, the dam bursts when overloaded. The human mind, however, might ignore it first, but if it cannot, it becomes stressed and we might have emotional outbursts when overloaded with too many voices or too many things to remember. But one of the best mechanisms of dealing with information overload is perhaps our long-term memory, where we store things we don't need right now. So the question is, how do we retrieve information once it's stored in our long-term memory? Alvin Toffler, who was born in 1927, an Estonia-born Canadian psychologist who, instead of studying how the memory stores information, focused on how we retrieve the stored memory. Just like Ebbinghaus, Toffler used words to test how memory worked. He used his students as subjects and read a list of words to them. Then he asked them to recall those words. Most of his students were able to recall about 50%. Then, to see if there was any difference, he gave them hints or organized those words into categories like color, animals, food, tools, transport, etc. His students were able to recall more. He concluded that memory works much better when information is organized or compartmentalized into neat categories. Not only that, Toffler also discovered that there was a distinction between 2 types of long-term memory: semantic memory, where you store factual information like data, and episodic memory, where you store experiential information like an event or conversation. As a result, he made a distinction as to how we remember and retrieve those memories. Facts and figures are recalled based on meaningful categories like words related to certain group. But episodic memory is retrieved not so much by their categories, but by the time and often place, because those memories are often emotional ones. So he called the retrieval of this kind of memory more akin to time travel to a particular event like a birthday or a party, etc. This episodic memory is beautifully depicted in Marcel Proust's novel In Search of Lost Time, in which he used sensory triggers like smell, sound, taste, touch that can involuntarily transport us to the past event or people we have forgotten. So time and place are extremely crucial when it comes to episodic memory. With semantic or knowledge-based memory, Proust called it voluntary memory, in that we can voluntarily recall them. Toffler also said that besides semantic and episodic memories, there was a third type of long-term memory, which he called procedural memory, where we store skills. For example, skills such as driving, cooking, riding, bike, or certain crafts or even playing sports are part of this procedural memory. So to sum up, Toffler used unorthodox techniques to observe long-term memory and divide it into 2: factual knowledge or emotional experience. While we can retrieve factual information by organizing them into categories, we retrieve emotional experiences through time and place. Emotional memory. Now that we have understood how human memory works, let's tackle the other elephant in the room: human emotions. How is memory tied to our emotions? Are they related at all? Gordon Bauer, born in 1932, died in 2020, was an American psychologist, and he argued that memory and emotions work in tandem. When in a happy mood, we are more likely to store happy memories, and when unhappy, we tend to store more negative memories. In other words, our mood influences what we remember, and our memory simply obeys our mood. It is the same when we recall. When happy, we recall happy memories, and when in bad mood, we tend to recall unhappy memories better. Quote, people who are happy during the initial experience learn the happy events better. Angry people learn anger-provoking events better. So it turns out what we remember depends on how we feel at the time. In other words, happy people tend to remember the positive things, while unhappy people tend to remember and recall the negative ones. So Bauer's research found that our emotional state affects our memory. Since our memory is closely tied to our emotions, it also means that what we remember is not necessarily the truth. We all know that our emotions cloud our judgment when it comes to the truth, but do we also remember things that are not true? Elizabeth Loftus, who was born in 1944, is an American psychologist who argued that what we remember is not always the truth. The reason for that is that our memory is closely tied to our emotions, as Gordon Bauer argued earlier, and what we remember depends on our mood. Loftus carried out a study in which she showed her subjects a traffic accident. How she described the crash, her choices of word influenced the subject, determining the speed of the cars. If she used words like bump, most subjects thought the cars were moving slow, and when she used the word smash, they thought the cars were moving faster. According to Loftus, our memory of a particular event can be distorted by 4 distinct factors. 1. Our current emotions and beliefs. 2. Subsequent experiences after the event. 3. Other people we trust. And 4. Depending on the type of the questions we are asked. In other words, what we think is the truth can be influenced by how we felt at the time, what happened later, other people we love, and shaped by a leading question. Her research was influential in criminal trial procedures where witness testimonies are extremely important in determining the truth of what happened. So sometimes our mood distorts the truth because it makes us feel better if the truth or untruth favored our mood. We create our own stories in our head when we are emotionally invested in an experience which may not reflect reality. Loftus carried out another study in which she collected the stories about her subjects passed from their relatives. Among the 4 stories, one was false, in which the subject was supposedly lost in a shopping mall. While most participants were vague about the mall experience, some accepted it as true. When told that one of the 4 stories was false, the majority singled out the mall story as false. But what's crucial is that about 20% of the participants chose another story, a true story, to be false. Loftus says, in real life, as well as in experiments, people can come to believe things that never really happened. Of course, this is harmless when it comes to daily lives, but that 20% thinking a false story to be true can have huge legal implications during a trial. Loftus called it false memory syndrome, where some people are able to invent stories that are not true, yet they vehemently believe it in their head. So to sum up, Elizabeth Loftus' research showed that our memory is not as reliable as we think it is. Since our memory is closely tied to our emotions, it can easily be distorted by other factors such as mood, time, people, including who is asking. While harmless in most situations, it can have dire consequences during the legal process. This also proved that human memory is not like a computer because our emotions influence what we remember and what we forget. Since we are pretty selective in what to remember, are we also selective in what we forget? Daniel Schachter, who was born in 1952, an American psychologist, further questioned our memory's reliability. Not only do we forget things, we also get confused, and on some occasions we really want to forget. While memory is an amazing evolutionary tool we have, Schachter focused his attention more on the negative side of memory. While the positives are many, it can also be extremely unreliable. He came up with 7 sins of memory. 1. It's fleeting. 2. We are absent-minded. 3. We block certain things. 4. We misattribute sources. 5. We are susceptible to suggestions. And 6. We are inherently biased. And finally, bad or traumatic memories always persist despite us trying to forget them. In his studies, Schachter concluded that it's a good thing that our memory is unreliable, otherwise we would be overwhelmed with so much useless information. So our brain works because it has to be very selective. Quote, we don't want to memorize every bit of every experience. We would be overwhelmed with clutter of useless trivia. So to sum up, cognitive psychology saw how behaviorism simplified the human mind to some behaviors conditioned by the environment. According to cognitive psychology, the mind has a mind of its own that affects the environment through intelligence as well as deeper insights. As a result, our perception of reality is not a passive one-way street that we only receive information randomly, but rather we ask for specific information and even put a structure to all the information we receive. It's like a postal system that not only sorts things out, but also asks for certain information to be stored and retrieved based on our beliefs, convictions, but most crucially based on how we feel. Since our attention is very limited, we have to be selective in how we absorb the information. It's like a data going through a funnel which sorts things out. Useful information is retained and useless information is either discarded or thrown into the unconscious mind where it stays until it's useful or triggered later on. Cognitive psychologists saw memory as the most effective tool of the human mind. We gather information and categorize and organize them for immediate use through our short-term memory or later use through retrieval from long-term memory. We also learned that remembering and retrieving memories is also tied to our emotions. Our mood determines what sort of memories are kept. Also, our memory, despite being a great help, also can be unreliable and susceptible to false information. So all these studies lead us to one fundamental question. Is the human brain a powerful computer? While most scientists describe the human brain as a computational and how it deals with information, in recent years there is a theory that the human brain might be quantum in essence. One of the key proponents of quantum brain is the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Roger Penrose. The basic idea is that since the human mind develops in leaps and bounds, it cannot be computational. Consciousness cannot be computational, therefore it might be quantum. But let's leave that debate here and move to how cognitive psychology helps us when it comes to therapy. Cognitive therapy. Cognitive psychology also gave rise to cognitive therapy and the cognitive behavioral therapy. While psychotherapy focused on the unconscious, cognitive therapy is more focused on perception or the conscious mind. Illnesses such as OCD or paranoia has a lot to do with our perception. Therefore, cognitive therapy involves recognition of the problem, rational explanation, and then some behavioral changes in which the patients are active participants. Aaron Beck, born in 1921 and died in 2021, argued that while psychotherapy relied on each patient's account because the unconscious cannot be empirically studied, cognitive therapy, on the other hand, can be studied empirically because it studies perception, which is our consciousness. To treat a disorder, one must understand it on the perceptual level. He likened psychoanalysis to religion because both functioned on faith rather than empirical data. To treat his patients, Beck asked them to assess their perception against reality. In other words, when one compares their thoughts and ideas against the objective reality, one can easily see if their perception of reality is distorted or not. We often make things up in our mind. For example, the world is not as terrifying as some would make up in their mind. Or the world is not as beautiful as some would imagine it to be. A good example is what is called Paris syndrome, in which the Japanese tourists visiting Paris have a distorted perception of the city as a kind of romantic heaven on earth. When they come face to face with the reality of Parisian people, often cold and rude, their expectations are crushed, and when they return to Japan, they go through a therapy and special clinics set up to treat this syndrome. Another example is the old saying that some people see the glass as half empty while others see it as half full. So our perception of reality has a lot to do how we feel about reality. So cognitive therapy relies on bridging patients' perception with this objective reality. Beck famously said, "Don't trust me, test me." So to sum up, Beck had a problem with psychotherapy as it relied on something you couldn't test. So his cognitive therapy was based on perception and how you see the objective reality. To cure such disorders, one brings them back to reality and bridges perception with the objective reality. Fun fact, Aaron Beck lived to be 100 years old. So positive thinking and living in reality or surrounding yourself with positive people can influence someone and how they perceive the world and themselves. Another form of treatment has been mindfulness, especially meditation techniques and yoga, which have been trickling down from Eastern religions like Hinduism and Buddhism and Taoism. Since Eastern religions emphasize being in the present, fully aware and fully conscious, which can bring us down from our cloud nine world we have created inside our head. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, born in 1934 and died in 2021, was a Hungarian-American psychologist who emphasized what he called flow, somewhat akin to the Chinese philosophy of Taoism. When we are absorbed in activities we enjoy, we tend to forget time. Not just that, we feel a serenity that gives us clarity of mind. Since we are extremely focused, we also tend to forget our own existence. This he called the state of ecstasy. He wasn't saying that you get this state through drugs, but through work you enjoy the most. Fiction writers, artists, athletes, musicians, and monks experience this when they are fully absorbed in what they do. In other words, they almost transcend from their own body and move into a different realm of reality where mind is neither focused on the past or future, but solely focused on the present activity. How do you achieve this state of flow? One way to achieve it when you challenge yourself. For example, when you are engaged in an activity that matches your level of skill, but the task is slightly more challenging. If something is just too hard, where your skill is nowhere near it, it would make you anxious. Also, if something is extremely easy, you get bored. So the perfect balance is when the task is just slightly above your skill that demands your best effort or eagerness to learn. This matches how we perceive purpose in storytelling. A hero must face challenges, and his or her true character comes out in how he or she overcomes problems. So to put it simply, cognitive psychology is mostly focused on attention and memory. So our body gives us sensation through our senses, and our mind gives us perception. In other words, how we perceive reality can impact how you see the world and your own capability. So cognitive psychology is a more positive approach compared to behaviorism and psychoanalysis. Why? Because for cognitive psychology, productivity was an important application of their work. While behaviorism blamed conditioning and psychoanalysis blamed the unconscious, cognitive psychologists were interested in how to improve the mental productivity of an individual and make people more competent. It's no coincidence that cognitive psychology came about during the Cold War when the capitalist West wanted to show the socialist East that they had a more superior system of production. So far, I've discussed psychology from an individual perspective that we have each a psyche of our own and somewhat operates independent of others. In the next segment, I'll discuss social psychology and how society, culture, history, and other people influence our mind. Humans are one of the most social species on Earth.